Hi, I'm Phyllis and my website is southernfrugal.com. This morning I wanted to do a video on all the different types of flour, or all the types that I use. I have been asked this question over the last 6.5 years more times than I can even count, because a lot of young cooks, both young men and young women, don't know the difference, and it gets real confusing when you're in the grocery store and looking at all the different types of flour. So we'll just go over the types that I use. I don't use all of them, like I don't use rice flour, and there are probably a couple more I don't use. But we're going to go over the ones I do use. Now, the most frequent question is, we can't find self-rising flour in our country. And there might be some places in the United States where you can't find it. So you can easily make your own by using all-purpose flour, baking powder, and salt. It's just really easy. Now I'm going to hold up this card so it makes a real strong impression on you by looking at the visual. 1 cup of flour, 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and I would just sift those together. So you can easily make your own self-rising flour. Alright, so let's get started then. On the all-purpose flour, and I do use White Lily. It's a soft winter wheat. This is really good for cakes, almost as good as cake flour, but not quite as good. So the all-purpose flour you can use for making cakes, muffins, whatever, and you usually add teaspoons of baking powder and salt according to the recipe. So many recipes don't call for self-rising flour, they call for all-purpose, and then you add the baking powder and the salt as the recipe directs you. Now, self-rising flour. Now I use Adlu because we've got an Adlu company in downtown Columbia, and this is always fresh and it makes fantastic biscuits. So self-rising flour already has the baking powder and the salt in it. So that's self-rising flour. Now you could use this to make cakes, and the way you do that is when the recipe calls for baking powder and salt, you just eliminate that and go ahead and use the self-rising flour. The ingredients wouldn't be exact, but they'd be close. So you definitely could use the self-rising flour to make cakes and muffins and cupcakes and all that. All right, next one is bread flour. Now I use King Arthur bread flour simply because I think it's the best. Now, what makes bread flour bread flour? What makes it so good for making breads and rolls and all that have yeast in them is that it's got a lot of gluten in it, a lot. And so what does the gluten do? The gluten is the thing that makes the flour stretch. Now, gluten is not formed in flour until you add some type of liquid. So when you're making bread flour, you need it, and the reason you need it is to develop the gluten in the flour, and that will make it stretchy. And when it's stretchy, it will make those little bubbles that make bread rise, because the yeast produce an alcohol that expands the gluten in the dough, and that's where you get the texture of bread. Now, when you're making a cake, you do not want to use bread flour. The reason is because you'll have a texture that's more like bread than a fine texture like cakes. All right, I hope I made that clear. All right, next one, cake flour. Now, cake flour is a lot finer flour than all-purpose flour, self-rising flour, and certainly more so than bread flour. Now, what makes the difference is, of course, this is, I guess, always made from soft winter wheat. And I want to just read you this off the box here. All right. So the cake flour, this particular brand, is sifted 27 times to make it finer than all-purpose flour. And it is still an all-purpose flour in that it doesn't have any salt, baking powder, or just regular all-purpose flour. It's just the plain flour. And so what that means is this flour is going to have less gluten in it than bread flour, and that's so it can make a fine texture for the cake. All right, this tells you that the tips for making a perfect cake, and I just wanted to read this. So, preheat the oven before mixing. Sift flour once before measuring. Now, why is that? Because flour gets packed down. Even when you get it in the cup, say you've measured out 1 cup, it's still going to be packed a little. So what you want to do is sift the flour first and then spoon it into the measuring cup, and then take the straight edge of a knife and just even it out. Then you'll have the right amount for the recipe. And so always use level measurements and bake at the given temperature. And it tells if the cake is done. Use a cake tester by putting, I usually use a toothpick, down close to the center of the cake. Take it out. If the toothpick's clean, the cake is done. So anyway, this is real good, of course, for cakes. And again, the difference is it makes a much finer texture than bread flour would make. Now, the other 2 flours that I use sometimes, coconut flour, and I use the almond flour. Now, you can make some great pie crust with either one of these flours. There is no baking powder, no salt, nothing. It's just ground up. So hold on a minute. I gotta sneeze. All right, we're back. Please excuse me. So the coconut flour and the almond flour I used in making the bonbons before Christmas. And this does taste like coconut, and this does taste like almond. Now, this is my favorite, the almond. But you can make pie crust with these because they don't rise. And to me, they make great pie crust, but you're going to get the taste of the almond, and you're also going to get the taste of the coconut. But they do make great flours to make crust if you want a certain type of crust for pies. Now, a lot of people use these 2 flours to make cookies also. I don't think I've done that. Probably not. But anyway, I do use them. Now, there's also rice flour and many other different types of flour. I don't use any of those. I just use the basics. So again, let's go over it. Self-rising flour contains baking powder and salt already in the flour. All-purpose flour is really kind of just what it says. You can use it to make bread, you can use it to make cakes and whatever, but it does not have any baking powder or salt in it. And it's not as fine as cake flour. You can use cake flour just the same way you use all-purpose flour, but it's going to make a finer texture. And it's more expensive, I might add. Now, I was using any type of baking powder in the past. In the comments, several people wrote in and said you should use the Rumford because it doesn't have aluminum in it. So I switched. And regular salt. And of course I used the Himalayan pink salt in that little container. And that's another question I get asked a lot. Where did I get my little salt box? And it's made out of bamboo. It's been really great. I've had it for a number of years now, and I've got it on my website under products I highly recommend, and I do. The salt never gets all clumped together. Why, I don't know, but there's no finish on this. It's just 100% bamboo. All right, so I think that sort of explains it. Now, if some of you ladies that do a lot of baking and cooking, I know you have different ways that you use the different flours, so if y'all would leave those in the comment for our young cooks to read, then we can get a lot more ideas. Now, someone told me, I don't know when it was, years ago, that cake flour had cornstarch in it. Now, I don't know about that because the box doesn't say it's got cornstarch in it, but what it does say is it just says enriched cake flour, bleached white flour, and then it talks about niacin, iron, thiamine, and riboflavin, and folic acid. And the government does require that they add those things to the flour. Now, I want to talk about the whole wheat flour. You notice I don't have a bag of whole wheat flour. I rarely use it. And what happens with whole wheat flour is that it doesn't have as much gluten in it, just simply because it's got the whole, they call them wheat berries. It's got the encasing of the little berry all in it. It's not been separated. It'll be more brown when you make bread with it. And I have made, I could probably count on two hands the number of times I've made whole wheat bread. And every time, the recipe usually calls for at least some bread flour or all-purpose flour. And the reason for that is simply to get more gluten in the dough so you can have a little bit better texture. If you make the whole wheat bread with 100% whole wheat flour, it's not going to rise very much because it doesn't have enough gluten in it to make the little bubbles and all that. So, but whole wheat bread I think is very tasty. I really like it, but I don't like the way it doesn't get as tall as regular flour does when you make a yeast type bread. But I know a lot of people do use that, and there's all kinds of other flours that you can add when you're making bread, and you can put all kinds of seeds and oatmeal and all that. And wait, that's another one I forgot, the oat flour. Now, when I want to use oat flour for something, I make my own. And let me just show you. I've got some right up here. Hold on. Right there. And this is the type of oatmeal I use for our smoothies in the mornings. But when I want to make oat flour, I make my own by putting this in the little small beaker. They call it the, what do they call that? Smaller beaker of the Vitamix. They call it the, you don't add water to it. In other words, you can put some of this in that small beaker and make your own oat flour. And I have used that for muffins and that type of thing, but mostly I use this to go in smoothies. All right, I can't think of anything else right now, but this is not an all-inclusive about flour. It's just the basics. So, all right, I hope this has helped some of y'all. So next time I get the question on we can't find self-rising flour, I'm going to just make reference to this very video, and that way it'll help explain it a little better than I can answering in the comments. All right, so if y'all got anything to add to this, please put it in the comments down below so we can all learn. All right, see y'all next time. Bye for now.